I'm Rob Forsyth, and this is Liberalism in Question, a series of podcasts from us here at the Centre for Independent Studies on issues around classical liberalism, its strengths, its weaknesses, its challenges, its history. Today I'm particularly interested in its history here in Australia. My guest is Stuart Piggin, an Australian historian who's been specialising in the history of Christianity in this country. He served as the director of the Centre of the History of Christian Thought and Experience at Macquarie University, has written many books on the area, and the two that I most was impressed by were these two books on the history of evangelical Christianity, that is, enthusiastic Protestantism, to use a phrase, in Australia. The first called The Foundation of Public Prosperity, Evangelical Christians in Australian History, 1740 to 1914, before the First Fleet, by the way, and then the second one, Attending the National Soul, Evangelical Christians in Australian History, 1914-2014. And one of Stuart's great theses is that rather than have simply a secular view of the role of Christianity in Australia and liberalism, that evangelical ideals have influenced key aspects of our nation's development, education, philanthropy and political movements. Stuart, welcome.
Thank you, Liz.
What in your mind is classical liberalism?
Well, classical liberalism is all about the freedoms. It's a break from what society was like before it became probably the most prominent ideology or philosophy in European history, and it was all about, I think it was all about freeing up society. So it was all about the freedoms: freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, freedom of the press, and also economic type freedoms. And that was very important in early Australian history.
Explain that. So, how was it important in early Australian history? We often think of early Australian history in very different categories.
Yeah, well, one of the fascinating early characters in Australian history was Robert Campbell of the Wharf. He was called that because he had a warehouse on Sydney Harbour near Circular Quay today, sometimes known as Merchant Campbell. And what he did was he brought free enterprise. He was a father of free enterprise in Australia, because when Philip came and established the first settlement, that was a command state, and commerce was not allowed. And that's why the Rum Corps developed, because they needed something to have means of exchange and so on. So rum came in as a currency, but it was incredibly corrupting, because the people who had monopoly of rum were able to charge huge prices for their things. So Robert Campbell of the Wharf, evangelical Scot, vital Christian, said we must have honest commerce. And that's one of the things about liberalism, I think, that it's all about accountability and therefore honesty, as well as so it's about responsibility.
Command economies often lead to rent-seeking and corruption, as a matter of fact.
Yes. So very early in Australian history, before 1800, he was starting to move in that direction, and it made a big impact on Australia. I think, though, that the thing to take into account about liberalism in Australia is that it's reflecting much bigger issues in the European continent. When you think about Britain and how Britain was affected by liberalism, it sort of had an ambivalent attitude towards it because of the French Revolution. And liberalism, I suppose, was critical to the French Revolution because of liberty rather than equality and fraternity. I think the chief thing there was liberty. And so there were many who liked that, but because it was revolutionary and violent, the powers that be in Britain reacted against it. And so the sort of liberty, the sort of philosophical liberalism that you had in France did not receive the same sort of reception as it did in Britain, which prompts me to make this point, that when you look at liberalism, you always have to contextualise it. History is always a discipline of context. You have to give place and people to explain exactly what people are thinking. So
it's not something you can effectively well thought of in abstract terms.
yes, yeah. All isms are subject to that problem for historians, that they're not grounded enough, they're not contextualised enough. So in our books, you'll notice that we don't call it evangelicalism, we call it evangelical Christians. They're people, and a historian can write about people rather than these abstractions. So when it comes to liberalism in Australia, it's very different from the sort of liberalism in other parts of Europe.
And yet influenced by Europe.
They're influenced by it. And indeed, if Australia had been colonised by the French, as a lot of historians are talking about nowadays, things might have been very different. The thing about French liberalism was that it levelled out the society in a way that was not achieved in Britain. There was an equality, so that hierarchy and things like that. By the time of the First World War, hierarchy, the classes, that sort of thing, was no longer nearly as prominent in France as it was in Britain. People who visited Paris and London in the First World War, like General John Monash, for example, commented on this. It was an amazing difference between the two. But the problem with French politics was that it couldn't achieve any stability. It was constantly, they had these constant revolutions. So you had sort of liberal type revolutions, not only in 1789, but again in 1830 and again in 1848. And it was very, very destabilising, really. So one of the things that's sort of cardinal about liberalism as it was received in Australia, I guess, was that it was committed to gradualism, to evolution rather than revolution. It was all about gradual increases of human rights, the progressive enfranchisement of the population, so on, which is really rather British.
Were there forces opposed to it in the early infant colony? Did people try and impose a strict order and reduce freedom?
Yes, it's a very good question, Robert. It's a very good question because I know the answer.
Normally politicians say that when they don't know the answer, so you're a refreshing difference.
Well, it's just that you can do it one way or the other, can't you? It's to give yourself some time to think about what you're going to say.
Exactly.
What happened, I think, was that you find the sort of liberalism that you're interested in, the freeing up of things, not only in somebody like Robert Campbell of the Wolf, so it's not only economic liberalism, but you also find it in Governor Macquarie when he sought to emancipate the convicts and got into all sorts of strife with those like Samuel Marsden, who was opposed to the emancipation of convicts.
He was one of the senior chaplains at the time.
He was one of the senior chaplains at the time and was hardly liberal in his attitude to these things. But Macquarie was, and it was remarkable at the time. There's another aspect, I think, of liberalism that Macquarie embodies, and that is the importance of progress. Liberalism, I think, is committed to progress, and Macquarie wanted to revolutionise the physical aesthetics of the new colony, and he went overboard in doing this in the opinion of the people back home in Britain. And so you had the big report, which took him to task. And
that's BIGG, not BIG, yes.
Yes. And said all sorts of conservative things about poor old Macquarie. So Macquarie was then followed up by Governors Brisbane and Darling. And their job, in answer to your question, was to impose an establishment on the New South Wales colony. And so their idea was to have a squire and a parson in all the different districts of the colony. Big made sure that the first Archdeacon Scott, was given, I think it was a third of the land of New South Wales in order to fund the church in its educational role. And of course it came to nothing. And it came to nothing, I think, because history was going in a different direction. The people of energy in the colony tended to be nonconformists, dissenters.
You're speaking of the Church Association here, by
the Church Association.
Explain that there is Roman Catholics, there's Anglicans, Church of England, then there are those in on the Protestant side who are not part of the established church, hence not conformists or dissenters.
Yes.
Methodists, Baptists,
Congregationalists.
and so
Yes,
forth. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you. They are the latter, the Congregationalists, the Methodists and the Baptists, the nonconformists, the dissenters. They're the ones who are most interested in liberalism, I think. These are the ones who politically are most
You mean most
to
not just
liberalism.
of the Christians, but in the society?
In society. It's just because they're all about the importance of the human rights which they did not have in Great Britain. So they came out to Australia in the same way that I guess that the early settlers came to America in order to have greater freedoms and rights. And I think Cromwell, the example of Cromwell and the Commonwealth and sort of thing, they're the sort of models as distinct from kings and queens of the establishment. So anyway, to get to the point.
Yeah, please. I'm enjoying the trip.
Sorry to be so incoherent about all this, but what happened was that the establishment experiment didn't work. And so Governor Burke then took over, 1831. And he came from Ireland. He was a liberal Anglican by inclination. And he wanted to make sure that all the people in the colony, Catholics, as well as Anglicans and nonconformists, dissenters, all had an opportunity to get ahead. And since it was a convict settlement, still many of the population were of convict extraction or were convicts themselves, he thought such a population is not going to build churches, not going to provide schools, therefore the state will have to do it. Now that's where this sort of liberalism departs from classical liberalism. Because classical
I was going to ask this.
all about the withdrawal of the state.
In Australia, there's strong state involvement from quite early on. The railways, the schools.
This is very important, I think.
Right.
I think we've completely missed the boat on this one. That's because, again, we have thought about the relationship between church and state as some sort of philosophical abstraction, as if it can exist out there as an idea. Right. But when you look at church and state in America, compare with church and state in Britain, church and state in Australia, completely different. And if you look at the history of Australia over 200 years, I think we've only had one period of separation of church and state. That was from about 1870, when you had the Free, Compulsory and Secular Education Acts, probably going through until Menzies gave the Catholics.
That is...
So it's about 56...
Am I right? Education was...
30... I suppose it's about 80 years.
So
separation of church and
early
state.
on it was thought that the church, meaning the Church of England...
Before that you had an establishment.
Would run
and then
education.
You had establishment, and then when Burke came along, and what Burke did was he funded the building of churches, and he gave money to Catholics, Congregationalists, and not the Congregationalists wouldn't have it because they didn't believe it, but he gave it to Methodists and Anglicans and Presbyterians. So there are 4 churches, and these 4 churches were built in even tiny communities. One of the bits of research which I'm most proud of in my life is when I was lecturing at Wollongong, I said to my class one time, how about we write a history of the local churches? And so the class went about it. We made a list of all the churches. And what we found was that in any small community, like Kiama, Jamberoo, Wollongong itself, you always had these 4 churches, all built about the same time, all costing about the same amount of money, coming very quickly as soon as these communities were formed. And I think historians have, again, our books are so big because historians have missed all this. We've had to put it all in. They've missed the point entirely. What historians say is, this explains why Australians were so sectarian, because you had all these churches competing with each other. And in actual fact, what it meant was that you had not only 4 churches, but normally 4 ministers, all inculcating some form of Christian faith. And so Australians became incredibly Christianised in terms of values.
There you are.
And now the relationship between those values and liberalism is interesting. The chief Christian values are faith, hope and love. The great contribution which Christianity made psychologically to the world, I think, is humility. Humility's got a lot going for it in terms of the insights that it gives you. Faith, hope and love. I mentioned Robert Campbell of the Wharf. There's a lovely monument to Robert Campbell in St Philip's Church in
Can I
York
say,
Street.
and this is personal closure, every Sunday morning I look at that, because that's my other job. I'm a side hustle.
Well, tell us about this lovely monument.
No, it's I'm interviewing you.
Well, it's just that it is a lovely monument, and it's faith, hope, and love. Three beautiful women, and it's absolutely striking. I noticed when I went down to Melbourne recently at St Jude's Carlton, I've got the same thing in stained glass windows, faith, hope, and love. And I think probably it was all over the place. It's all about compassion and hope for the future, and I suppose love is all about charity. And evangelical Christians in Australia in the 19th century were by far the largest group in terms of providing the welfare state, the charitable sector in Australian society at that particular time.
Can I ask you a question then? You just draw attention to the powerful influence of Christian values in 19th century society, which in many cases led to liberal values.
Yes. Oh, that's right.
There is a narrative which is the opposite narrative, which is secularisation is good because the Christians are all a bunch of wowsers and trying to close things down. I'm thinking of the whole people like Lindsay and others, this sort of view that the Christians were restrictive. You're saying that's not an accurate representation of our history.
Well,
Christians weren't trying to tell one what to do all the time.
There were Christian wowsers, but I think the sorts of Christians who really made an impact on Australian society were people like, there was a whole group of Christians called the Congregational Oligarchy, who were around John Fairfax of the Sydney Morning Herald and his editor, John West, and Thomas Holt, and David Jones, the retail person. Very wealthy, very progressive. Fairfax and West did not believe in using the state to enforce morality. They were anything but wowsers. Yeah, so you get both groups within the Christian church itself. It's two different sides of evangelical Christianity. But Robert, getting back to values, it is very interesting that the churches were so prominent in Australian society. I mean, churches are much closer to people than governments, for example. Governments are remote. Churches are everywhere, 4 churches everywhere, and all these ministers doing their thing. But they themselves, when they thought about what they should talk about, it's not only the gospel they inculcated, but it's also their civilisation which they brought with them. And what they brought with them was the classical values as well as the classical virtues as well as the Christian values.
By classical, I mean going back to Greece and Rome.
Yes.
Yeah.
So courage,
Prudence,
fortitude. There's another which I forget. There are 4 classical virtues and 3 Christian values, and these are the mainstream values that Australians have.
In fact, it's interesting, a mutual friend of ours, Professor Edwin Judd, made the point, as I understand it, that Western culture is both a combination of classical and Christian values in tension almost with each other, but feeding on each other.
Yes. The point that Professor Judge makes about this is that the biblical values are other person-centred. So it's your concern to be faithful to another. It's your concern to have compassion to another. The classical virtues are all about my integrity,
Yes.
my courage, my moderation, my sense of justice, and so on. So what they're all about, I think, is my rights. So the virtues are about rights, and the biblical values are about responsibilities. And those are the two sides of liberalism, you see.
The two sides of liberalism,
rights and responsibilities.
You are.
Coming in through the classical and Christian virtues.
One of the themes in this series has been that liberalism is not firstly, not clear and obvious, not one thing, but also that it's contingent upon a certain historical history and place.
Yes.
And I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. Getting back to the whole idea of the separation of church and state, this is where liberalism in Italy, I think, was very important.
In Italy?
In Italy.
Yes.
What happened there was that the movement for the unification of Italy, I think, started in about 1846. And in that year, Mastai Ferretti became Pope Pius IX, Pio Nono. And he had a reputation for being a liberal. And Metternich, who was the Austrian Chancellor.
Yes, right, yes.
Thank you.
Happy to help the historian.
I need all the help I can get. He thought, I've reckoned with everything but a liberal pope. Fancy having a liberal pope. He said in the Ferretti family, everyone's liberal down to the cats. And that revolution in Italy in 1848, because there were revolutions all the way through Europe in 1848, that revolution got rid of Metternich. But it also horrified Pius IX. He'd done all sorts of liberal things in order to prove his liberalism. He set up an observatory and he had science and all sorts of things going for him. He was going to allow health developments in Rome and so on, which they hadn't had before. All that came to a stop. He was horrified, and he became probably the most reactionary Pius IX. And he, as you know,
There's nothing as a liberal as an ex-liberal.
Well, good point. Probably that's true. And in 1864, the papacy promulgated the syllabus of errors. And there were 80 errors, and error number 80 was liberalism. Liberalism and civilisation are errors. And this is important for Australia, because in Australia you have the Catholics, most of them from poor Irish backgrounds, trying to establish a foothold in society. And here their own leader is saying, poo on civilisation, and there's no way that you're going to have liberal values here. So politicians like Sir Henry Parkes made hay of that, because it meant that what they'd said about the Catholics were right all along. In
other words, it fed into some of the sectarianism that was developing.
It was very powerful in that way.
Church and state in Italy, you're saying?
Church and state in Italy. What he was what the Pope did, which was wrong, in my humble opinion. I mustn't say this is a Protestant, so I shouldn't be saying where Catholics are wrong, but from a historical point of view, the mistake that the Pope made was that he took what was the situation in Italy, and he made out that it was universal throughout the world. So he thought when Cavour, who was the Prime Minister of Piedmont, Sardinia, and who was one of the leaders, along with Garibaldi and Mazzini, of Italian unification, he was the one who came up with a free church and a free state. He was very strong on this. And it led to the dissolution of the monasteries like it had in Britain a few hundred years earlier, and so on. But this caught on, and in America also there's a very strong shibboleth, free church and a free state sort of thing. No state support for religion. And I think that this was something which Australians had to work out for themselves. So in answer to a point that you made half an hour ago, namely that you were astonished at how involved the state was in education and all sorts of things, I think that for most of our history, Australia has been not about the separation of church and state. At its best, it's all been about the complementarity of church and state. That works best when the two of them try to work out what's best for society. So in Australia today, the state is supportive of all sorts of religious organisations in health, education, welfare, and it's much bigger here, the state support for these organisations and institutions, than it is in America or in Britain. Much bigger. We are a far more Christianised country than those places, even though the view is that we are a secular sort of country. We're the most godless nation on earth, all that sort of nonsense. in actual fact, the state has cooperated with the churches and the churches with the state for the betterment of Australia chronically.
Where does that come from then, the belief that we are the most godless nation on earth, that we're very secular? Is it because of the nature of the Christianity? It's a practical rather than a theoretical. It's not as dogmatic. Can you comment on the nature of Australian Christianity and its therefore its compatibility with liberalism in a way that it wasn't, for example, in other countries like in Europe?
I think that as I worked out in some detail at the beginning of our first volume, most Australian history has been written by secularists. A survey was done at the time when we wrote that book, and when we started to do the research for that book about the time of Australia's bicentenary, a survey of the convictions of historians, and the survey found out that over 50% of Australian historians were either atheists or agnostics. At that time, only 8% of the Australian population claimed to be atheistic or agnostic. So the history profession was way out of kilter with the rest of society. And the history profession has dealt with all sorts of things which interest them, like trade unions and things which secularists are interested in. And they have been tone deaf, blind to the religious element, I think.
There's a book about memorials in Australia. It's a Ken Inglis book on what's it called?
Yes, it's about war memorials.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think I read the book and enjoyed it, but I think you made a point. It completely ignores the massive war memorials in churches.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Which is,
extraordinary.
In my experience, working here in old Sydney, part of Sydney, they're everywhere. That's an example of that blindness.
Yes, it is extraordinary to me because Ken Inglis was actually, he actually wrote those. Remember that in our youth there was this thing called a current affairs bulletin?
Yes, I do.
And it was never revealed who wrote them, but Ken Inglis wrote the current affairs bulletin on the visit of Billy Graham to Australia in 1959. He was like all the rest of the press in Australia at that time, very impressed by Billy, and there was very, very little criticism of Billy at that time. So one would have thought he would have been more sympathetic. Come to this book on the war memorials. It's very strange.
So if I understand what you're saying, that liberalism in its Australian form, which is a distinct form elsewhere, we mustn't talk abstractly, has been deeply influenced, particularly by the various Protestant groups, particularly you've got evangelical Christianity, which in those days would have been the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Congregationalists and some of the Anglicans. But that history has tended to be somewhat blind to this phenomenon because of the particular view of the 1980s, 1970s intellectual class, who by this stage had become quite negative towards Christianity.
We began our first volume, as you observed, in 1740, because that's 48 years before the First Fleet, but it's the Evangelical revival
in the United Kingdom.
In the United Kingdom, and in America. And in our books, we trace the impact of that on the settlement of Australia mainly through the interest in the abolition of the slave trade. So there's another freedom, by the way, that liberalism certainly stood for, freedom from slavery.
And that was a religious crusade, wasn't it?
That was a religious crusade, and
fascinating.
And we found, which we found quite fascinating, was the First Fleet in Australia was so successful, hardly anybody died on the First Fleet. Convicts, when they got here, were heavier than when they got on the boat because they were so well provisioned. That's because the people who put together the First Fleet were anti-slave traders, and they said, well, this is not going to be anything like the slave trade. So they made sure that the ships were seaworthy and the convicts were well fed and so on. It was a maritime marvel, the First Fleet, and it was because of the Evangelical revival. Well, I think that sort of influence continues. Evangelicalism, if I can use an ism, along with liberalism and so on, it's one of the great powers of the 19th century. It is a terribly influential movement which we tend to have overlooked.
Tell me about the relation with Indigenous Australians.
Yeah.
An anti-slavery movement comes to a country, there are people here already, what happens there?
Yes. The understanding of this matter is a matter for the future. I still don't think we've got on top of it yet. I remember going to Groote Island, I suppose 30 years ago now. I'd just been in India, suffering culture shock from being in this strange place, India. Then I went to Groote Island, but I thought, I had this definite feeling at the time, I've never been to a place as different as this. This is more different than India.
Yeah, you are. And yet it's Australia.
It's Australia. Indigenous communities, it's such a different culture. It's taken us all this time to begin to understand them. And for them to begin to understand us, I think it really is a big enterprise. It's a big job to try
So
to
even there, evangelicalism, evangelical Christians, led a lot of the charge against the settler violence, against Aboriginal people, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, today there is many more Christians per head of population amongst Indigenous Australians than amongst the rest. So there's been some impact there.
Yes. The best historians on this say that whatever good the white person did for Aboriginal people in Australia was far too little, but most of it was done by the Christians.
Let me rush you to today, because today Australia is well, it is more secular in truth in its public stands, although no doubt you might say still deeply influenced by Christian values, just there underground, not acknowledged. Do you have any idea of how the future might go? I know you're a historian, therefore the future is for someone else to write about, but are you confident of where we're going, or do you have misgivings about the present state of these issues?
I'm an appalling prophet. Get everything wrong.
Oh, good. Well, therefore tell us and we'll do the opposite will happen.
But on the basis of what's happened in the past, there have been times in Australian history when we've been identified as being hugely secular, and then within the next decade it all turns around. I mean, one of the most religious decades in Australian history was the first decade of the 22nd of this present century, when Rudd and Howard and these people were in charge, and they were Christians, and they were talking about Christian things all the time. And in Parliament, people didn't know how to talk about it because the vocabulary wasn't there. They hadn't talked about these things for a generation. Suddenly, everybody wants to talk about it.
And it's often greeted by the commentariat with your cynicism. They can't mean what they say.
The literati tend to be rather ignorant of this as well, which is why our books had to be so big.
So thank you very much. I've been speaking on just touching the toes in the water on the wonderfully rich river of the history of Australia. Only 230 something years, and yet so much of the settlement, and let alone before that, and particularly of the rise of liberalism, and interaction in particular with evangelical Christianity. And my guest, Stuart Piggin, thank you very much. There's so much more we could have talked about. Thank you for being on Liberalism Question.
It's been a huge pleasure.
This is Liberalism Question. I'm Rob Forsyth. Thank you for watching.